My sister-in-law threw away my mother's recipe box. She called it clutter. She said nobody would ever use those old, yellowed cards again. She said we needed to move on from the past. I watched her drop the entire box into a black trash bag. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. Because I already knew something she didn't. Something that would change everything. My name is Callista Vance. I am 43 years old. And this is the story of how my sister-in-law, Adele, threw away something priceless and then spent the next 6 months begging me to forgive her. It started with a clean-out. My mother, Helena Vance, had passed away 3 years ago. She was 71. A quiet, unassuming woman who never made a fuss about anything. She cooked every meal from scratch. She grew her own herbs in a small garden by the kitchen door. She never bought anything processed or prepackaged if she could make it herself. And she had a secret. A secret she shared with me, and only me, about a year before she died. My mother's secret sauce recipe. I need to explain what that recipe actually was, because it matters to the whole story. My mother had spent almost 30 years perfecting a barbecue sauce. Not the kind you buy at a grocery store. Not the kind you throw together for a family cookout. Something much more deliberate and much more valuable. She started working on it when I was a teenager, around the time my father, Edward, first bought an old smoker from a neighbor's yard sale. He loved cooking outdoors. He loved experimenting with different flavors. And my mother, who had always been the one in charge of the kitchen, started experimenting too. She tried different combinations of ingredients, different proportions, different cooking methods. She kept notes on index cards, recording every single attempt, every adjustment, every result. She failed a lot. She told me once, years later, that she had thrown away more batches than she could count. Some were too sweet. Some were too spicy. Some just tasted like nothing, flat and uninteresting. But she kept trying. And then, about 15 years ago, something clicked. She found the perfect combination. I remember the first time I tasted it. I was home from college for the summer, and my father had fired up the smoker for a family gathering. My mother brought out a small bowl of sauce, the color of dark mahogany, and told everyone to try it on their ribs. Nobody said much at first. But then my Uncle Harold, who never complimented anyone's cooking, looked at my mother and said, "This is the best thing I've ever eaten." My mother just smiled. She always smiled when people praised her cooking, but this time, the smile was different. Quieter. Like she knew something nobody else knew. She had created something special. Over the next several years, my mother perfected the recipe even further. She wrote down every detail. The exact measurements. The specific brand of a particular spice she insisted on using. The precise temperature and cooking time. She kept all those notes on index cards, organized by date and experiment number, in a battered old recipe box that had once belonged to my grandmother. She never told anyone outside the family about the recipe. She didn't sell it. She didn't try to commercialize it. She just made it for family gatherings, quietly, without ever making a big deal of it. And then, about 6 years ago, something happened that changed everything. A food blogger named Margot Hennessy attended a church picnic where my mother had brought her famous ribs. Margot wrote a glowing post about the best barbecue sauce she'd ever tasted, and the post went viral in the food world. Suddenly, people were contacting my mother, wanting to know about her sauce. That was when the letters started arriving. Food companies. Grocery chains. One major food manufacturer even sent a representative to our small town to try my mother's sauce in person. They all wanted to buy the recipe. My mother, who had never been interested in money or fame, was genuinely surprised by the attention. She told me once, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, that she had never considered the recipe as something that could be sold. It was just something she made for the people she loved. But the offers kept coming. The largest offer came from a regional food company called Henley's Fine Foods. They had been in business for over 80 years. They were looking for a signature product to launch a new line of premium condiments. They offered my mother a significant sum of money for the exclusive rights to her recipe. My mother, to her credit, didn't jump at the offer. She wasn't interested in selling something she had poured so much of herself into, at least not for any price they were offering. But she did agree to one thing. She agreed to let Henley's Fine Foods draft a formal contract, just in case she ever changed her mind. She wanted to keep her options open, she told me, without committing to anything she wasn't sure about. The contract arrived in the mail about 3 weeks later. It was a thick document, full of legal language my mother didn't fully understand. She took it to a local attorney, a careful, unhurried woman named Priscilla Ng, who reviewed it thoroughly and explained every clause to my mother in plain English. My mother signed the contract with one important caveat. She did not sell the recipe outright. She agreed to a first right of refusal arrangement. If she ever decided to sell the recipe, Henley's Fine Foods would have the first opportunity to buy it at a pre-negotiated price. The price was substantial, over 6 figures, but my mother was not required to sell unless she wanted to. And the contract made one other thing very clear. The recipe itself, the actual formula, the precise combination of ingredients and cooking methods, was considered proprietary information. It belonged exclusively to my mother. If anyone, for any reason, destroyed the written records of that recipe, they would be liable for damages. That contract, along with the detailed recipe notes and the signed agreement, was carefully stored in my mother's recipe box. The recipe box that Adele threw away. I want to explain Adele more fully because she's central to this story. Adele married my brother, Douglas, about 11 years ago. She was, and is, a woman of strong opinions and a somewhat forceful personality. She works as an interior designer, a job that apparently requires her to be decisive and direct, though she often brought that same decisiveness into family settings where it wasn't always welcome. She never particularly liked my mother. I don't mean that harshly. I just mean that she saw my mother as a relic of a simpler time, someone whose values and priorities didn't match Adele's more modern, more ambitious outlook on life. My mother was quiet. Adele was loud. My mother valued home and family. Adele valued appearances and advancement. They simply operated on different wavelengths. I think Adele genuinely believed, in her own way, that she was helping when she volunteered to clean out my mother's house after she passed away. She didn't understand that she was removing the accumulated memory of an entire life. She saw clutter where I saw history. She saw junk where I saw treasure. Douglas, my brother, has never been good at standing up to Adele. He loves her. He respects her. He simply doesn't have the strength to push back against her when she decides something. That's why, on the day of the cleanout, Douglas didn't stop her. I had arrived later than I planned, stuck at work at the veterinary clinic where I've worked for the past 18 years. When I finally made it to my mother's house, Adele had already been working for several hours. She had filled 13 garbage bags by the time I walked through the front door. The living room was stripped bare. The kitchen counters were completely empty. The cabinets were open and vacant. And in the middle of the kitchen floor, ready to be hauled out to the trash, sat my mother's recipe box. I recognized it immediately. The faded green cardboard. The slightly crooked handwritten label on the front, Helena's Kitchen, written in my mother's familiar, careful handwriting. Is that my mother's recipe box? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Adele shrugged. Just some old recipes. Nobody's going to use them. We can't hold on to everything, Callista. It's just clutter. I bent down and opened the box, already knowing what I would find. The recipe cards were gone. All of them. The notes. The experiments. The carefully recorded measurements. And the contract. The signed, legally binding contract that made my mother's sauce recipe worth a significant sum of money. I stood up slowly, the empty box in my hands. Where did you put the cards, Adele? In the trash. Where else would I put clutter? I walked to the garage. The trash bags were already tied up, ready for pickup the next morning. I opened every single bag. And I found the cards, mixed in with old newspapers, broken kitchen items, and other garbage. But the contract, the thin legal document that represented my mother's legacy and her potential fortune, was not there. I searched through every bag a second time. Nothing. The contract was gone. The contract, I said, my voice shaking now. The one from Henley's Fine Foods. The one my mother signed. Did you throw that away too? Adele shrugged again. What contract? I didn't see any contract. Just some old papers. If it was in that box, it's in the trash. We've already taken everything out. I sat down on the garage floor, surrounded by bags of my mother's carefully preserved history, and I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something more patient. My mother was in negotiations to sell that recipe, I said, very quietly. The contract was worth over $100,000, Adele. And now it's gone. Adele's face didn't change at first. She just stood there, looking down at me on the garage floor, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. That's absurd. She would have told us if she had something like that. You're making this up. I'm not making anything up, I said. I can prove it. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the email account where I kept copies of everything my mother had ever sent me. I showed Adele the email. The one from Henley's Fine Foods. The one confirming that they were sending a contract. The one that specified the exact amount they were willing to pay. Adele read it in silence. Then she read it again. And for the first time since I'd known her, my sister-in-law looked genuinely afraid. What does this mean? She asked. It means, I said, that you threw away something that was worth a lot of money. And that you might have just cost this family a significant amount of money. And that I'm going to need to call an attorney. The attorney I called was Priscilla Ng, the same careful, unhurried woman who had reviewed the contract for my mother years earlier. She listened to the whole story without interruption, taking notes as I described the clean-out, the recipe box, the missing contract. The first thing we need to do, she said, is confirm whether the contract was actually destroyed. My records show that your mother had a copy sent to my office as well. Standard practice for her. She liked having everything properly documented in multiple locations. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. So the contract still exists? Technically, yes. I have a copy in our files. But we also need to consider what her destruction of the original might mean legally. If that contract was deliberately destroyed, even if we have a duplicate, there are potential implications. Priscilla explained something important to me then. The contract, on its own, was not actually the sale of the recipe. It was a first right of refusal agreement. It gave Henley's Fine Foods the right to be the first to negotiate if my mother ever decided to sell. But the actual recipe, the formula itself, was still my mother's property. If that recipe had been destroyed, along with my mother's detailed notes, something truly valuable might have been lost forever. Can we recreate the recipe? Priscilla asked. I thought about it. My mother had made that sauce hundreds of times. I had watched her. I had helped her. I had memorized many of the ingredients. But the exact proportions? The precise timing? She had never written those down anywhere except on those index cards. The cards that were sitting in garbage bags in the garage. The recipe cards, I said. They're still in the trash. I found them before the garbage truck came. Get them, Priscilla said. Now. And don't let anyone touch them until we've had them properly preserved and documented. I spent the next 3 hours in my mother's garage, carefully sorting through the trash bags, rescuing every single index card, every note, every written scrap that Adele had dismissed as clutter. I found almost all of them. Almost. There were a few missing cards, the ones that contained my mother's most recent and most refined version of the recipe. The ones she had been working on in her final months. Those cards were gone. Adele, when I asked her about them, claimed she didn't know what I was talking about. She said she never saw them. She said I was being dramatic. But I remembered seeing them in that box just a week earlier. I remembered because I had helped my mother organize them during one of my final visits before she passed away. Those cards existed. And now they were gone. The missing cards were a problem. But the remaining cards were still incredibly valuable. Even with a few gaps, a competent food scientist could likely recreate the recipe. It would take time and effort, but it was possible. The real issue was the contract. Priscilla had a copy, yes. But the original was destroyed. And Adele had destroyed it intentionally, or at least carelessly, in the course of a clean-out she had no authority to perform. Here's what I recommend. Priscilla told me during our next meeting. We need to formally notify Henley's Fine Foods that the contract still exists, even if the original has been destroyed. We also need to send a formal demand to your brother and sister-in-law. A demand for what? For the value of the contract. Priscilla explained that even though the contract wasn't technically a sale, it represented a significant financial opportunity. By destroying the original contract, Adele had potentially damaged the family's ability to negotiate with Henley's Fine Foods. That damage had a measurable financial value. We sent the demand. Adele responded by coming to my house. She showed up unannounced, without Douglas, and stood in my small kitchen, looking completely out of place in her expensive designer clothes and perfect makeup. "Callista, this is ridiculous," she said. "You can't actually sue me for cleaning out your mother's house. That's absurd." "I'm not suing you," I said. "I'm asking you to compensate the estate for the damage you caused." "Those are two different things." "Compensate? For what?" "A few old recipes." "Not just a few old recipes. A recipe worth over $100,000. A contract that gave the family negotiating power. You destroyed that power when you threw away that box, Adele. There are consequences for that." She laughed. Actually laughed. "You're insane. Nobody is going to pay you $100,000 for some old sauce recipe. That's not how the world works." I didn't argue with her. I simply pulled out my phone and showed her something else. An email from Henley's Fine Foods confirming their ongoing interest in the recipe. A letter from the bank confirming that my mother's attorney had been in contact with them regarding the contract's value. And a copy of the contract itself, the one Priscilla had kept in her files, complete with my mother's signature and a notary stamp. Adele read through all of it in silence. When she finally looked up, the color had drained from her face. "All of this was in that box?" "All of it. And now most of it is gone. The original contract. The most recent recipe cards. Years of careful work. All gone." Adele didn't stay much longer after that. I don't think she knew what to say. The weeks that followed were some of the most uncomfortable I've ever experienced as a family. Douglas called me several times. He was caught in a difficult position, loving his wife, but also loving his mother and wanting to honor her legacy. He didn't know who to defend. I told him honestly that this wasn't about choosing sides. This was about justice. About honoring my mother's work and protecting what she had left behind. "Mom worked on that recipe for 30 years, I told him. 30 years, Doug. She poured her heart into it. And Adele threw it away like it was nothing." "I know," he said. "She didn't realize what it was. She thought she was helping. Intentions don't erase consequences. If I accidentally ran over someone's mailbox, I still have to pay for it, even if I didn't mean to." He had no argument for that. The demand letter we sent to Adele and Douglas was not an actual lawsuit. Not yet. It was a notification, a formal request for compensation. We gave them 30 days to respond. I thought about what my mother would have wanted. My mother, who was never interested in money. Who gave away most of what she had. Who never once asked for anything in return. I think she would have been sad about all of this. Sad that her work had been dismissed. Sad that her family was fighting. But I also think she would have agreed that something needed to be done. That you can't just throw away someone's life's work and pretend it didn't matter. The missing cards became the focus of our efforts. Priscilla found a food scientist named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who specialized in recreating lost recipes from partial documentation. She reviewed what we had, the remaining cards with their notes, my memories, the stories my mother had told me, and agreed to take the project on. It took 4 months. 4 months of laboratory work, experimentation, and frustrating near misses. But eventually, Dr. Tanaka succeeded. She had recreated my mother's recipe almost exactly. Her version of the sauce tasted virtually identical to the original. It was close enough that Henley's Fine Foods, after their own taste test, agreed to proceed with a formal offer. The offer, adjusted for market changes over the years, was not quite as high as the original. But it was still significant. Over $90,000. That's what the recipe was worth. $90,000 that Adele had almost thrown away forever. Adele finally agreed to a settlement when she realized how serious everything was. She and Douglas paid a portion of the lost value to my mother's estate, though not the full amount, and they also covered the cost of Dr. Tanaka's work and the legal fees. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about acknowledging the value of what had been lost. The remaining cards, the ones I had rescued from the garbage, are now carefully preserved in a fireproof safe. I still have them. I still look at them sometimes, reading my mother's careful handwriting, seeing the years of effort written in her own hand. I still make the sauce sometimes, too. For holidays. For family gatherings. For the simple joy of tasting something my mother created. Adele and I have not had a warm relationship since this happened. We are polite to each other, cordial when necessary. But the trust that might have existed is gone, and I don't think it's coming back. Part of me feels a little guilty about that. But part of me doesn't. Because when someone dismisses your mother's life as clutter, when they throw away something you know has value, something has to change. My mother gave me that recipe box at the end of her life. She gave it to me specifically because she knew I would understand its value. She knew that someone, someday, might not see what she had built. She knew that her work might be dismissed as just another old woman's hobby. So she made sure that at least one person in her life understood the truth. That recipe was her legacy. And I intend to protect it. If someone in your own family dismissed everything your mother built as nothing more than clutter, would you have handled it differently? I handled it the only way I knew how. With patience. With documentation. And with the quiet certainty that the truth, when you have the proof to back it up, will always find a way to win in the end.